A stitch too perfect, and a murder too clean. Welcome to Detective Echoes. Where are you joining us from as the threads unravel? Your attention sharpens every deduction. Let the case begin. It was on a bitterly cold January morning, with the soot of London thick in the air and the pavements glistening with a fresh coat of sleet, that I found myself once again in the familiar warmth of our Baker Street sitting room. A fire crackled cheerfully in the grate, and Holmes, with slippered feet stretched towards it and a Turkish cigarette smouldering between his long fingers, was idly perusing a sheet of figures scrawled in a careless hand. I had just returned from a routine call to Paddington Station, where one of my patients, a retired solicitor with a fondness for Madeira and misremembering prescriptions, had summoned me in a fit of imagined gout. I was peeling off my damp gloves when Holmes glanced up. "You missed Inspector Lestrade by a mere 15 minutes, Watson. He arrived in quite a state, poor fellow, and left me this curious artifact." Holmes gestured to the mantel, where a small wooden spool and a sliver of green woolen thread were placed as if part of some curious museum exhibit. "A tailor's spool," I ventured, stepping closer. "Very good," Holmes murmured, the corners of his mouth lifting. "Specifically, a type used in bespoke menswear workshops along the Savile Row corridor. The color of the wool is not mere affectation. It was torn from a suit not yet publicly released. Custom work, commissioned by a client of some standing, and found by the good inspector, clutched in the hand of a dead man on Half Moon Street." At this, I turned fully. "A murder?" "Most assuredly," said Holmes, now rising and pacing the length of the room with growing animation. "The victim's name is Mr. Terence Lavington, a solicitor of modest reputation, though recently he's been involved in the final arrangements of one Horace Billingsworth, a name you might recall from the Stockbridge misappropriation trial 2 years ago." "Ah, yes," I nodded. "Billingsworth, acquitted by a hair's breadth. A fortune involved, was there not?" "Quite. And the fortune seems to have resurfaced, at least partially, in the estate dealings Mr. Lavington was managing. Last evening, Lavington was found dead in his private lodgings, seated in an armchair. A faint scent of bergamot and lavender about the room, and that peculiar green thread wound tightly around his middle and clutched in his right hand as if torn from someone in a struggle." I examined the thread more closely. "It seems innocuous enough." "That, Watson, is the devil of it," said Holmes. "Innocuous things are precisely what murderers often rely upon. But there is more. Lavington's door was locked from the inside, and there is no sign of forced entry. A sealed room, a dead man with no sign of obvious wounds, and the only tangible clue a thread of green wool and a timepiece stopped at exactly 9:47. I whistled low. How did Lestrade take it? With the fortitude of a man watching sand slip between his fingers. "He suspects suicide." "I do not." Holmes turned suddenly, his gaze sharp. "Watson, would you care to accompany me to Half Moon Street? There is something in this affair that pricks the intellect most irritatingly, like a pin beneath a gentleman's collar." I agreed without hesitation, for I had long since resigned myself to Holmes's uncanny knack for turning the most mundane of circumstances into labyrinths of intrigue. As we stepped out into the sleeting London air, I tucked my notebook into my coat pocket, already preparing to document what promised to be another peculiar case. Half Moon Street is a quiet thoroughfare just off Piccadilly, lined with stately houses and respectable private residences. Lavington's chambers were situated in a brick-faced building 3 stories tall, the entry adorned with a polished brass plate and a rather grimy lantern. A uniformed constable nodded to Holmes as we ascended the stairs. The sitting room where Lavington had been found was untouched since the discovery. A singular gaslight flickered overhead, throwing a pale, restless glow on the modest furnishings. Holmes moved through the room like a conductor readying his orchestra, taking in the overturned cushion, the faint indent on the ottoman, and a solitary teacup resting on the edge of the mantelpiece. "Note, Watson," Holmes murmured, kneeling, to inspect the hearth. The ashes of a telegram burned incompletely, most unusual behavior for a man about to take his own life. He drew from the grate a charred scrap bearing partial text, "Reappointment 11. Matter concerning B, Worth Estate." Holmes tapped the watch on the side table. Still at 9:47, not a mechanical failure. Deliberately stopped. But how? Holmes straightened, his eyes gleaming. The better question is, who benefits from Lavington's silence? And why would someone go to the trouble of creating the illusion of suicide in a locked room only to leave behind a tailor's thread? He turned to the constable. "Has anyone reported a missing garment? Or perhaps an inquiry from a gentleman tailor about stolen property?" "No, sir," replied the man. "But we did have a Mr. Felix Braddon come by. Owns a tailoring shop on Cork Street. Claimed he recognized the wool type after hearing the description from a neighbor." "Then Mr. Braddon must be our next port of call," said Holmes. "Watson, we are about to descend into a world where precision is not just a craft, but a shield. Tailors do not often murder their clients, but then again, threads can bind far more than cloth." And with that, we exited into the fog once more, the case taking shape like a suit drawn carefully over its form, each stitch to be examined, every seam inspected. I had the distinct feeling that beneath the crisp folds of this murder lay a pattern designed not for fashion, but for concealment. Little did I know just how tightly that thread had been pulled. The fog had thickened by the time we reached Cork Street, the gas lamps casting only dim halos in the murk, as though reluctant to illuminate the secrets concealed in the folds of the city. Holmes strode with purpose, his coat flapping sharply behind him, while I kept pace with notebook in hand, aware that what had begun with a mere thread of wool now promised far more than a tailor's mislaid trifle. Felix Braddon's establishment stood at the corner of Cork and Welbeck, a narrow, tall building with bay windows on the second floor, and the name Braddon and Sons, tailors of discretion and distinction, etched in gold leaf across a dark green sign. Inside, the shop was meticulously ordered. Swathes of fine wool, cashmere, and houndstooth lined the walls like regiments of soldiers, and glass cases held silver thimbles, engraved scissors, and polished measuring tapes. A bell tinkled as we entered. Braddon himself was a wiry man in his early 60s, his moustache finely trimmed, his eyes sharp as shears. He emerged from a curtained rear room with a professional smile, but when he saw Holmes, the smile faded into wary recognition. "Mr. Holmes," he said slowly, "Inspector Lestrade mentioned you might take an interest." Holmes gave a brief bow. "Interest, Mr. Braddon, implies curiosity. In this matter, I am compelled by necessity. Scotland Yard tells me you recognized the thread found at the scene on Half Moon Street." Braddon nodded and motioned for us to follow him into the fitting room. There, amidst a semicircle of angled mirrors, he produced a swatch of green wool identical in shade and texture to the thread Holmes had shown me earlier. "I do bespoke work," Braddon said, his voice low. "This fabric, forest fen wool, is exclusive to a private consortium in Edinburgh. I acquired only a limited batch. Thus far, I have used it in just 2 garments, both suits. One commissioned for the Honourable Reginald Ferntree, the other for a Mr. Ambrose Damery." Holmes's eyebrows lifted faintly. "And were either of these clients known to Mr. Terence Lavington?" Braddon pressed his lips together, then walked to a small notebook resting on a shelf. He flipped through several pages. "I cannot speak to Mr. Ferntree's associations, but Mr. Damery, well, he came for 2 fittings earlier this month. On the second occasion, I heard him discussing a legal dispute with a gentleman waiting in my reception area. A solicitor. Later I learned that gentleman was indeed Mr. Lavington. Curious, Holmes murmured. And the garment for Mr. Damery, has it been collected? Braddon hesitated. Yes, only yesterday morning. In fact, I thought it odd. He seemed impatient to leave, though he barely glanced at the fit of the final product. Most gentlemen of his type are meticulous about their presentation. Holmes paced slowly. Might we see the measurements and pattern cut for Mr. Damery? Braddon raised a brow. Confidential, Mr. Holmes. Clients pay for discretion. Holmes nodded solemnly, then leaned in slightly. Mr. Braddon, a man is dead. His death masquerades as suicide. A tailor's thread was found clutched in his hand. The law does not look kindly upon those who withhold information in the course of an investigation. Braddon stiffened, then sighed, retrieving a folder from a locked drawer. He handed it to Holmes with clear reluctance. Inside were measurement charts, sketches of the garment, fabric notations, and the tailor's internal notes. Excellent, Holmes said. Watson observed shoulders slightly narrow for the chest breadth. Damery must hold himself erect, possibly military training. Hips uncommonly square. Rider, perhaps. Did Mr. Damery mention travel plans? Holmes asked suddenly. He did, Braddon replied, rubbing his chin. Said he would be out of town for a few days, business in Cambridge, I believe. Holmes returned the folder and straightened. Thank you, Mr. Braddon. You've been most helpful. One final question. Did Mr. Damery wear the suit when he collected it? Braddon frowned. No. He took it in a garment bag. Why? Holmes offered a faint smile. Because I suspect it has already made an appearance. Outside, Holmes walked. Briskly, hands clasped behind his back. Damery, Watson, there is our next point of inquiry. But what connection could he have to Lavington's death? I asked. A legal dispute, perhaps, but that hardly points to murder. Holmes halted beneath a street lamp, the fog swirling around us. You observed the thread, Watson, but not its placement. It was twisted between Lavington's thumb and forefinger, suggesting it was torn deliberately, possibly in the act of grabbing at a fleeing assailant. And the fact that it's identifiable to only 2 suits makes it damningly specific, I nodded. So Damery is our man? Let us not leap, Holmes replied, resuming his stride. But let us follow the trail with care. The following. Morning we made our way to Albemarle House, a gentleman's club of high repute where, according to Holmes's inquiries, Mr. Ambrose Damery often took luncheon. The porter, bribed with a discreet coin, confirmed that Damery had returned to town and was presently within. We entered the club's marbled hall, with its deep carpets and heavy drapes, the scent of cigars and wood polish in the air. Damery sat. Near the fireplace, a slender, well-groomed man of 40 with impeccably parted hair and an unreadable expression. He wore a grey pinstripe suit, immaculate but clearly not the green wool in question. Holmes introduced us with customary brevity. Mr. Damery, I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my associate, Dr. Watson. We require a few moments of your time. Damery's pale eyes flicked over us. To what end? Holmes gestured for a seat and lowered his voice. In regard to Terence Lavington, you were seen with him recently. He is now deceased. A flicker of surprise, not shock, crossed Damery's features. Deceased? How unfortunate. But I confess I barely knew the man. We had a few business discussions, nothing more. Holmes tilted his head. Did your dealings involve the Billingsworth estate? Damery stiffened. That is privileged information. Holmes's voice remained quiet, but insistent. And are you wearing the suit Mr. Braddon tailored for you when you met him last? Damery's composure broke slightly. What are you implying? Holmes smiled coldly. Only that Lavington was found dead with a very specific clue in hand, one tied to a very exclusive fabric. Damery rose abruptly. "If you'll excuse me, I have no further time for speculation. Good day." He departed swiftly, leaving behind a faint trail of expensive cologne and a distinct impression of unease. Holmes stood motionless for a long moment. Then, turning to me, he said, "He's frightened, Watson, not of the law, but of what might yet be discovered." "And what shall we do now?" I asked. "We follow the suit," Holmes said cryptically, "and pray it has not been sewn too tightly around a false trail." It was nearly dusk when Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, the light outside dimming into a kind of coppery gloom that lent the fog a ghostly hue. Holmes had said little during the cab ride from Albemarle House, but his mind was evidently whirring with calculation. His fingers drummed the edge of his cane, his eyes fixed on the rain-beaded window, watching the blur of passing carriages and shadowed pedestrians as though their movements whispered secrets. Back at our lodgings, Holmes wasted no time. He tossed his coat across the arm of a chair and moved directly to the hearth where he crouched, drawing from the ashtray the charred fragment we had salvaged from Lavington's fireplace. "I cannot shake the feeling," he said, "that this fragment of telegram is of greater importance than we yet realize. It refers to a meeting, possibly with Damery, possibly another, and the matter of the Billingsworth estate." He stood, pinched the bridge of his nose briefly, and then addressed me without turning. "Watson, we must learn more about Damery's connection to the late Horace Billingsworth. I believe there is a paper trail that may illuminate a motive. I shall write at once to my contact at the Land Registry. In the meantime, I want you to call upon Miss Clara Lavington, Terence Lavington's sister. She lives at 24 Belgrave Place. Ask her about her brother's recent activities, especially anything pertaining to Mr. Damery or the estate business. Do not alarm her, but be watchful. Sometimes grief reveals truths the living did not wish to share." I nodded. "And you?" Holmes smiled faintly. "There is a certain valet employed at Albemarle House who may have a more candid view of our Mr. Damery than the gentleman himself was willing to provide." We parted ways, and I took a hansom toward Belgrave Place. The address proved to be a modest but well-kept residence, nestled among a line of respectable homes with neat hedges and brass knockers. A maid answered the door, and upon hearing my name, she led me through a narrow hallway into a drawing-room of subdued elegance. Miss Clara Lavington stood as I entered, a woman of about 30, pale-faced, her eyes dark from recent weeping, yet composed with a quiet strength that bespoke an inner resilience, Dr. Watson, she said softly, extending her hand. "Mr. Holmes mentioned your name once, when Terence consulted him years ago during a case involving forged contracts." I inclined my head. "I'm terribly sorry for your loss, Miss Lavington. I won't intrude for long, but there are a few details of your brother's recent affairs that might help us understand what occurred." She nodded and sat beside the fireplace. "You may ask whatever you need." I opened my notebook. "Do you know if your brother had any recent disputes, legal or personal, that caused him concern?" Her brow furrowed. "Yes, there was one matter. A man named Damery. My brother mentioned him several times in the past fortnight, said he was uneasy about the legality of some property transfers related to the Billingsworth estate. He hinted that something was being concealed, that the documents he was asked to approve didn't match what was originally filed." "Did he confide in you further?" "He planned to confront Damery. I warned him to be cautious. Terence was many things, but subtle he was not. He believed in the law like some men believe in God. If he suspected wrongdoing, he would have exposed it regardless of the danger." I noted her words carefully. "Had he received any threats?" Clara looked away, her voice thinner now. There was a letter. Anonymous. He burned it the night before he died, but I saw part of it. It said, "You are meddling in what is sealed and will remain so." He dismissed it as bluster. I wish I had insisted he go to the police. You said he burned it? Yes, in the drawing-room fire. I suppose he thought it beneath his attention. My thoughts returned at once to the burned telegram Holmes had recovered. Perhaps the letter and the telegram had been destroyed in the same fire, each a piece of the puzzle reduced to ash. I thanked her sincerely and promised to relay any developments. As I rose to leave, she stopped me. "There's one other thing, Doctor. The day before his death, Terence received a parcel. A flat box wrapped in brown paper. He didn't say what it contained, but he locked it in his desk drawer and took the key with him. The police retrieved his belongings, but said the drawer had been forced open. The contents were missing." I paused at the threshold. "Do you recall who delivered the parcel?" She nodded. "Yes, a boy from a local errand service. Terence tipped him well. He was in good spirits that evening. I made note of the agency and left with a growing sense of unease. The missing parcel, the anonymous letter and the thread all pointed toward a coordinated attempt to silence a man uncovering something dangerous. Upon returning to Baker Street, I found Holmes pacing the room with an expression of quiet satisfaction. He glanced up as I entered. "Success?" I asked. "Moderate," he replied. "The valet at Albemarle House is fond of brandy and loose tongues." He confirmed that Damery left abruptly the morning after Lavington's death, cancelling a luncheon, and retreating to Cambridge without explanation. Upon returning today, he brought a new garment bag with him and paid a laundry service to collect several items from his flat. "You think he disposed of the suit?" "I think he's attempting to create a confusion of garments," Holmes said. "But we shall test that hypothesis directly. I have already summoned the laundry service and obtained a list of what was removed from Damery's residence. The green suit is not among the items, which either means he still possesses it, or has gone to great lengths to erase it." I relayed Clara Lavington's testimony, particularly the parcel and the missing document. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then we must retrieve the errand records. If we can identify who sent the parcel, we may unravel the motive itself." He crossed to his writing desk, where he opened a drawer and removed a single sheet of paper, the response from the land registry. "Observe, Watson. The Billingsworth estate, once valued at nearly £70,000, has been divided into 3 shell holdings in the past year. One of them, listed under the name Belden and Trust, shares a board member with a company controlled by Mr. Ambrose Damery. It's all buried beneath layers of names, but the linkage is there." I leaned in. "So Lavington discovered the connection, confronted Damery, and was silenced." Holmes folded the paper with deliberate care. "It is plausible, but we require one more proof." "And that would be?" Holmes looked at the window, where the fog was again pressing softly against the glass like a quiet intruder. "The suit, Watson. If we find the suit with a missing thread, then we have not only a motive but the means." He straightened, his posture suddenly decisive. "Tomorrow morning we call upon the errand office. Then we pay a visit to a man who knows how to alter appearances, but not always how to erase mistakes." I could see it clearly then, the outline of the case becoming more defined with each passing hour. But like a suit cut in haste, one poorly placed stitch could still unravel the entire design. The next morning found us beneath a sky the colour of tarnished pewter, the chill of winter clinging to the stone facades of London like a second skin. The city bustled as it always did, cabs jostling for space, newsboys crying out headlines, the clip of boots echoing along damp cobblestones. But within the cab that conveyed us to Hatterby and Sons' errand office, Holmes was silent, save for the occasional humming under his breath. It was the sort of tune he reserved for moments when deduction danced just out of reach, like a phrase on the tip of the tongue. Hatterby and Sons occupied a narrow front on Fleet Lane, wedged between a tobacconist and a grimy coffee-house. Inside, the office was orderly, with brass pigeonholes labelled for deliveries and a large leather-bound ledger open on a sloped counter. A young clerk, bespectacled and stiff with nerves, blinked rapidly as Holmes stepped forward and introduced himself. "We are here regarding a parcel delivered on the 26th of January, Holmes said without preamble, "addressed to Mr. Terence Lavington of Belgrave Place. We require the name of the sender, or at the very least the errand boy who delivered it." The clerk swallowed visibly. "Well, sir, we do keep a record. Yes, just a moment." He turned, flipping through pages of the heavy ledger with practiced precision, his finger tracing lines of black-inked entries. "Yes, here it is. Parcel to Mr. Lavington, 24 Belgrave Place, delivered at 4:30 in the afternoon. Signed for under initials TL. It was dispatched by a Mr. Julius Reed, collected from York Crescent." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "York Crescent, you say?" "Yes, sir." Holmes made a note in his pocketbook, then asked, "And the errand boy?" "That would be Ellis, sir." "Young chap. I believe he's out on an early run, but he should return within the hour." Holmes nodded. "We shall return. Keep Ellis close when he arrives." As we stepped outside, I turned to him. "Does the name Reed signify anything to you?" Gave a tight-lipped smile. "Only that it does not appear in the official holdings of the Billingsworth estate, nor in any known correspondence of Lavington's. That alone makes it significant." We walked the length of the block, eventually taking shelter in a nearby tea-room to wait for the errand boy's return. Holmes sipped his tea absently while scanning the morning edition, eyes darting through the pages as if searching for some half-forgotten name. After 30 minutes we returned to Hatterby's, where the clerk greeted us with a nod and summoned young Ellis from a back room. The boy, no more than 12, stood nervously twisting his cap in his hands. His cheeks were ruddy from the cold, his boots splattered with mud. "You delivered a parcel to Mr. Lavington 3 days ago?" Holmes asked gently. "Yes, sir." "Can you describe the man who gave it to you?" Ellis brightened slightly. "Tall fellow, dark beard, well-spoken, had a sort of foreign accent. He gave me a half-crown for quick delivery, said the package was important, told me not to wait for a reply." "Did he give you his name?" "Mr. Reed, sir." Holmes leaned forward. "Would you know him again if you saw him?" The boy considered. "Might do, sir. He had a scar right here." He pointed to a spot just below his left cheekbone, thin like a knife mark. "Thank you," said Holmes, handing him a coin. "That will be all." As the boy disappeared behind the curtain, Holmes turned to me, his eyes gleaming. "A scar, a foreign accent, and a fabricated name. Mr. Reed is a phantom, Watson, likely a courier in disguise. Whoever sent that parcel did so under great caution." "And what of the address?" "York Crescent." "That," Holmes said, tapping the side of his head, "is our next destination." York Crescent was a crescent only in name, a street of short, crooked terraces north of Euston Road, favoured by transient residents and unlicensed rooming. Houses. We arrived by mid-morning and made our inquiries at the address listed in the ledger, number 7. The landlady, a stout woman with a shawl and suspicious eyes, opened the door just wide enough to peer through. "Mr. Julius Reed?" Holmes asked. "Don't know no Reader, but we had a gentleman stay here last week, foreign sort, kept to himself, paid in cash." "Did he leave a forwarding address?" She snorted. "He left nothing but a sooty handkerchief and a smell of cigars. May we see the room?" A silver coin worked its usual charm, and soon we were ascending a narrow staircase that smelled faintly of coal and boiled cabbage. The room was sparse, just a bed, a battered wardrobe, and a writing desk. Holmes moved to the desk at once, pulling open its single drawer. Inside was nothing save a scrap of torn paper and a thin loop of waxed twine. He examined both carefully. "The paper's watermarked," he murmured. "Van Dusen and Co., stationers who supply solicitors almost exclusively. And this twine a match for what Braddon uses to wrap finished suits. Damery, no doubt, thought to be clever, but he's left traces at every step." I looked around the dim room. If Damery arranged the delivery, then the parcel must have contained something of grave significance. Could it have been a document, something to blackmail or threaten Lavington? Holmes nodded. Or perhaps something to test him. A forgery, perhaps, or an altered contract. If Lavington recognized it as fraudulent, it may have confirmed his suspicions. He stepped to the door, pausing with one hand on the knob. "We must return to Miss Lavington." The desk drawer was forced open. "We must discover whether any forgery or sensitive material has been uncovered among her brother's remaining effects." Clara Lavington received us with the same pale composure as before. She led us to her brother's study, where the desk stood, beside a curtained window. Holmes examined the drawer meticulously, noting the clean break at the lock and a fine scratch on the interior panel. "This was opened with a professional's touch," he said. "No splinters. Whoever took the contents knew exactly what they were looking for." "Did the police mention a missing item?" I asked. "They said it had been rifled," she replied, "but nothing specific was listed as stolen." Holmes knelt suddenly, pulling open the bottom drawer. After a moment, he retrieved a small folder tucked behind the divider. "Not quite thorough enough," he said with satisfaction. Inside were carbon copies of correspondence, including one addressed to the Crown Registrar, referencing questionable holdings and transfers made under Damery's name. "This," Holmes said, "is what they wanted to destroy, and they missed it." He turned to Clara. "Miss Lavington, I shall need to borrow these. They may hold the key to your brother's death." She nodded solemnly. "Anything you need, Mr. Holmes." As we stepped out once more into the grey London streets, Holmes clutched the folder like a lantern in the fog. "We have proof of motive," he said. "Now we must catch the culprit with the means." I followed in silence, the wind curling round my coat. The mystery, once threadbare and incomplete, was beginning to take shape, and at the centre of its tangled weave stood a man with a tailored alibi and a suit he dared not wear again. The next morning found us beneath a sky the colour of tarnished pewter, the chill of winter clinging to the stone facades of London like a second skin. The city bustled as it always did, cabs jostling for space, newsboys crying out headlines, the clip of boots echoing along damp cobblestones. But within the cab that conveyed us to Hatterby and Sons' errand office, Holmes was silent, save for the occasional humming under his breath. It was the sort of tune he reserved for moments when deduction danced just out of reach, like a phrase on the tip of the tongue. Hatterby and Sons occupied a narrow front on Fleet Lane, wedged between a tobacconist and a grimy coffee-house. Inside, the office was orderly, with brass pigeonholes labelled for deliveries, and a large leather-bound ledger open on a sloped counter. A young clerk, bespectacled and stiff with nerves, blinked rapidly as Holmes stepped forward and introduced himself. "We are here regarding a parcel delivered on the 26th of January, Holmes said without preamble, "addressed to Mr. Terence Lavington of Belgrave Place. We require the name of the sender, or at the very least the errand boy who delivered it." The clerk swallowed visibly. "Well, sir, we do keep a record." "Yes, just a moment." He turned, flipping through pages of the heavy ledger with practiced precision, his finger tracing lines of black-inked entries. "Yes, here it is. Parcel to Mr. Lavington, 24 Belgrave Place, delivered at 4:30 in the afternoon. Signed for under initials TL, it was dispatched by a Mr. Julius Reed, collected from York Crescent. Holmes' eyes sharpened. York Crescent, you say? Yes, sir. Holmes made a note in his pocketbook, then asked, And the errand boy? That would be Ellis, sir. Young chap. I believe he's out on an early run, but he should return within the hour. Holmes nodded. We shall return. Keep Ellis close when he arrives. As we stepped outside, I turned to him. Does the name Reed signify anything to you? He gave a tight-lipped smile. Only that it does not appear in the official holdings of the Billingsworth estate, nor in any known correspondence of Lavington's. That alone makes it significant. We walked the length of the block, eventually taking shelter in a nearby tea-room to wait for the errand boy's return. Holmes sipped his tea absently while scanning the morning edition, eyes darting through the pages as if searching for some half-forgotten name. After 30 minutes, we returned to Hatterby's, where the clerk greeted us with a nod and summoned young Ellis from a back room. The boy, no more than 12, stood nervously twisting his cap in his hands. His cheeks were ruddy from the cold, his boots splattered with mud. You delivered a parcel to Mr. Lavington 3 days ago, Holmes asked gently. Yes, sir. Can you describe the man who gave it to you? Ellis brightened slightly. Tall fellow, dark beard, well-spoken, had a sort of foreign accent. He gave me a half-crown for quick delivery, said the package was important, told me not to wait for a reply. Did he give you his name? Mr. Reed, sir. Holmes leaned forward. Would you know him again if you saw him? The boy considered. Might do, sir. He had a scar right here. He pointed to a spot just below his left cheekbone. Thin like a knife mark. Thank you, said Holmes, handing him a coin. That will be all. As the boy disappeared behind the curtain, Holmes turned to me, his eyes gleaming. A scar, a foreign accent, and a fabricated name. Mr. Reed is a phantom, Watson, likely a courier in disguise. Whoever sent that parcel did so under great caution. And what of the address, York Crescent? That, Holmes said, tapping the side of his head, is our next destination. York Crescent was a crescent only in name, a street of short, crooked terraces north of Euston Road, favoured by transient residents and unlicensed rooming houses. We arrived by mid-morning and made our inquiries at the address listed in the ledger, number 7. The landlady, a stout woman with a shawl and suspicious eyes, opened the door just wide enough to peer through. Mr. Julius Reed? Holmes asked. Don't know no Reed, but we had a gentleman stay here last week, foreign sort, kept to himself, paid in cash. Did he leave a forwarding address? She snorted. He left nothing but a sooty handkerchief and a smell of cigars. May we see the room? A silver coin worked its usual charm, and soon we were ascending a narrow staircase that smelled faintly of coal and boiled cabbage. The room was sparse, just a bed, a battered wardrobe, and a writing desk. Holmes moved to the desk at once, pulling open its single drawer. Inside was nothing save a scrap of torn paper and a thin loop of waxed twine. He examined both carefully. The paper's watermarked, he murmured. Van Dusen and Cole, stationers who supply solicitors almost exclusively. And this twine? A match for what Braddon uses to wrap finished suits. Damery, no doubt, thought to be clever, but he's left traces at every step. I looked around the dim room. If Damery arranged the delivery, then the parcel must have contained something of grave significance. Could it have been a document? Something to blackmail or threaten Lavington? Holmes nodded. Or perhaps something to test him. A forgery, perhaps, or an altered contract. If Lavington recognized it as fraudulent, it may have confirmed his suspicions. He stepped to the door, pausing with one hand on the knob. We must return to Miss Lavington. The desk drawer was forced open. We must discover whether any forgery or sensitive material has been uncovered among her brother's remaining effects. Clara Lavington received us with the same pale composure as before. She led us to her brother's study, where the desk stood, beside a curtained window. Holmes examined the drawer meticulously, noting the clean break at the lock and a fine scratch on the interior panel. "This was opened with a professional's touch," he said. "No splinters. Whoever took the contents knew exactly what they were looking for." "Did the police mention a missing item?" I asked. "They said it had been rifled," she replied, "but nothing specific was listed as stolen." Holmes knelt suddenly, pulling open the bottom drawer. After a moment, he retrieved a small folder tucked behind the divider. "Not quite thorough enough," he said with satisfaction. Inside were carbon copies of correspondence, including one addressed to the Crown Registrar, referencing questionable holdings and transfers made under Damery's name. "This," Holmes said, "is what they wanted to destroy. And they missed." Yet he turned to Clara. "Miss Lavington, I shall need to borrow these. They may hold the key to your brother's death." She nodded solemnly. "Anything you need, Mr. Holmes." As we stepped out once more into the grey London streets, Holmes clutched the folder like a lantern in the fog. "We have proof of motive," he said. "Now we must catch the culprit with the means." I followed in silence, the wind curling round my coat. The mystery, once threadbare and incomplete, was beginning to take shape, and at the center of its tangled weave stood a man with a tailored alibi and a suit he dared not wear again. It was just after 8 o'clock the following morning when Holmes rapped smartly at the door of Scotland Yard's offices on Victoria Embankment. The air outside was biting, yet his expression remained composed, even bordering on amused. In his hand, he carried the satchel containing the altered green suit, the recovered claws, and the incriminating thread, all the material evidence needed to confront Ambrose Damery with a truth he had hoped to stitch permanently out of sight. Inspector Lestrade received us in his usual brisk manner, though his eyes were already curious. He gestured for us to follow him into a private chamber at the rear of the building. The moment the door closed behind us, Holmes unfastened the satchel and laid its contents out across the polished oak table with the methodical air of a physician, presenting symptoms to a panel of doubters. "You will find, Lestrade," he began, "that Mr. Terence Lavington did not, as your earlier conclusion suggested, die by his own hand. He was murdered, or at the very least, brought to his end, through the deliberate machinations of one Ambrose Damery." Lestrade lifted a brow but said nothing. Holmes continued, "Here is the suit worn by Damery the night of Lavington's death. It was subsequently altered by a tailor in 7 Dials to disguise its provenance. Hidden within a seam was this paper, a hand-copied clause, drawn from the original Billingsworth estate documents. It contradicts the fraudulent version submitted by Damery's firm. The thread found clutched in Lavington's hand, it is a direct match to the repair stitch in this sleeve." Lestrade leaned in. "You're certain it's Damery's?" "Yes." "We confirmed the suit's origin with Felix Braddon, the original tailor, and the alterations with Mr. Laskin, who provided a physical description of the man who commissioned the work, one matching Damery precisely, down to the scar on his cheek." Holmes folded his arms. "You now possess motive, means, and material evidence. I suggest we act swiftly." Lestrade scratched his chin thoughtfully. "We could bring him in for questioning." Holmes cut him off. "No, that will not suffice. He is too clever to be broken by interrogation alone. He will weave another story, another alibi, and he may still find a way to conceal the truth. I propose a more surgical approach." He stepped forward, lowering his voice. "We shall bait him." Lestrade narrowed his eyes. "How?" "Simple," Holmes said. "He believes the suit is gone, the document destroyed. We shall arrange for a fictitious witness to emerge, someone who claims to have seen him enter Lavington's chambers on the night of the murder, carrying that same suit." "You mean to bluff him?" I mean to set a stage on which he will trap himself. Men like Damery believe themselves immune to consequence because they craft their world from layers of fabric, of the legal sort and otherwise. But even the finest suit phrase when one tug is placed on the right thread. Holmes turned to me. Watson, I shall need your services this afternoon. You will pose as our fictitious witness, and we shall allow word of your statement to reach Damery through the usual back channels. I blinked. Me? You, my dear fellow, possess the perfect blend of respectability and anonymity. You will be seen by the clerk in Lestrade's front office. You will speak loudly enough that certain ears overhear just what we intend them to. He smiled faintly. And Damery, faced with the possibility of exposure, will act. That afternoon, we returned to Scotland Yard, where Holmes briefed the front desk clerk and positioned him accordingly. I entered through the main hall in a flurry of purpose, asking for Lestrade and declaring that I had urgent evidence in the matter of Terence, Lavington's death. My voice echoed just as Holmes instructed. I mentioned a sighting. I described a man in a green wool suit entering Lavington's residence near 10 o'clock the night of his death. I even added, for theatrical flair, that the man appeared flustered and left in haste. Within an hour the bait had been taken. A small note arrived at Lestrade's desk by messenger. It was unsigned but written on thick vellum. Holmes read it aloud. To whom it may concern, be cautious in how you pursue that which may unravel. Not all knots are meant to be untied. A friend. Holmes chuckled. Predictable. A veiled warning. He feels the walls closing in. Lestrade frowned. You really believe he'll make a move? I am certain of it. And I believe I know what that move will be. Watson, prepare yourself. We may be needed before the sun rises tomorrow. Holmes was not mistaken. Just after midnight, a constable stationed near Damery's residence on Fitzwilliam Lane observed a figure slipping out the back door, moving swiftly through the shadows. The constable, alert to Holmes's instructions, did not intervene but trailed him discreetly. The figure moved through narrow alleys, eventually arriving at a quiet law office bearing the name Cartwright and Sykes. Inside, the man remained for nearly 30 minutes before emerging with a valise under his arm. He then made for Charing Cross Station. Holmes and I, already positioned nearby in anticipation of just such a move, fell into step behind him as he crossed into the station's rear platform entrance, a place frequented by porters and rarely patrolled at night. There, under the flickering lanterns and beside the rattling of freight cars, Holmes approached him. Mr. Damery, he said quietly, may I relieve you of that burden? Damery turned, startled, but recovered quickly. Mr. Holmes, what business have you with me at this hour? The same business you attempted to leave behind in that valise, the business of Terence Lavington's death. Shall we see what treasure you carry? Damery's grip tightened on the handle. I don't know what you think you're implying. I think, Holmes said evenly, you returned to your offices in hopes of retrieving the original Billingsworth documents, the very ones you altered and which would incriminate you if brought to light. You have come to destroy the last evidence? Damery's eyes flicked left toward a side gate, but Holmes was faster. With a swift motion, he raised his cane and tapped twice on the ground. Two plainclothes officers emerged from the shadows. Mr. Damery, one of them said, you are hereby detained under suspicion of conspiracy to defraud and obstruction of justice. As the officers moved in, Holmes lifted the valise. Inside were several ledgers, handwritten notes, and at the very top a second, unaltered copy of the same clause we had found in the suit, bearing Lavington's initials. Holmes handed the valise to Lestrade, who had just arrived. Proof enough? He asked dryly. Lestrade nodded. More than enough. Damery said nothing as he was led away, but the faint tremor in his jaw betrayed the unraveling of his carefully sewn defense. Back at Baker Street, Holmes sat quietly as I stoked the fire, the weight of the case now resting behind us. "You knew he would return for the documents," I said, "even after all his precautions." "Men like Damery always do," Holmes replied. "Because what they fear most is not justice, but exposure." He tried to remove the loose threads, but in doing so he tightened the noose. He stared into the flames. "This case," he said softly, "has always been about concealment, fabrication in every sense of the word. A suit altered, a truth hidden, a man silenced. But even the most intricate garments leave traces when they are ripped apart." He turned to me with a rare glint of weariness in his eye. "Rest, Watson. The worst is behind us. But I have the oddest feeling that some hidden seam in this affair is not yet unstitched." I watched him for a moment before, returning to my notes, unaware just how prophetic his words would soon become. For most men, the conclusion of an investigation brings a sense of closure, but in the case of Sherlock Holmes, it more often marked the beginning of another layer yet to be revealed. And so it was on that grey Thursday morning, following Ambrose Damery's arrest, that I found Holmes seated in his armchair before the fire pipe clenched between his teeth, gazing fixedly at the sliver of paper we had retrieved from the altered seam of the suit. He had scarcely touched his breakfast. I, on the other hand, was halfway through my second cup of tea when he finally stirred from his reverie. "Watson," he said quietly, "there is something that does not sit well." I looked up. "In what sense?" Holmes did not answer at first. He removed the document from the envelope on the table and held it toward the window, examining the grain of the paper and the depth of the ink. Then he turned to me with a curious light in his eye. Why was this clause rewritten by hand and hidden in the suit rather than the original being preserved intact? I shrugged. Perhaps Lavington feared the original would be stolen and wished to safeguard the content without risking the official document. "A reasonable theory," Holmes conceded. "Yet does it not strike you as peculiar that a solicitor, methodical, precise, and by all accounts upright, would hide a reproduction of a vital clause in a client's suit rather than lodge it, with the courts or with his sister for safekeeping?" I frowned, the steam from my cup curling between us. "You suspect the clause was not placed there by Lavington?" Holmes leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I suspect we have been operating under a false assumption that Lavington in his final moments was the architect of this breadcrumb trail. But what if the suit was tampered with not to conceal evidence but to plant it?" "Surely not," I said. "You yourself confirmed the stitch was consistent with the repair of the torn thread." "I did. But this document, this copied clause, was written with a hand remarkably similar to Lavington's, yet not identical. Observe the L in Lavington. The curvature is slightly exaggerated. The loop is too wide." I took the paper and examined it. To my untrained eye it was immaculate. Yet I had seen Holmes deduce a man's profession from a smudge on his cufflink. His scrutiny rarely failed him. "You believe the document is forged?" "I believe it was intended to appear authentic enough to incriminate Damery," Holmes said, standing now and beginning to pace. "And so far it has done so. But the question that must be asked is this: who benefits most from Damery's fall?" I sat in stunned silence. "You mean to say someone has orchestrated this entire affair to frame him?" Holmes nodded. "It is not beyond reason. Damery is guilty of fraud, without doubt. But murder? I begin to doubt it." He stopped before the fireplace. "You recall the name Clara Lavington mentioned? The anonymous letter her brother received warning him not to meddle in what is sealed?" I nodded. "Yes. Burned, like the telegram, and both written with an unusual turn of phrase," Holmes said. "The letter, 'Not all knots are meant to be untied.' The note Damery sent to Lestrade, 'Be cautious how you pursue that which may unravel.' He turned, eyes gleaming. "Watson, language is a signature, and I believe the same hand penned both warnings. But that would mean Damery did not write the warning at all." "Precisely." There was a long pause between us. Then Holmes moved swiftly to his desk, took up his pen and wrote a brief telegram. "To Felix Braddon, urgent. Require immediate interview. Suspect connection deeper than tailoring." "Holmes." He rang the bell and handed the telegram to Mrs. Hudson for dispatch. "Braddon," I said, surprised. "You think he's involved?" "I think," Holmes replied coolly, "that Mr. Braddon has not told us everything." An hour later, we were seated once more in the dark panelled office of Braddon and Sons. The tailor greeted us with his customary reserve, though his expression darkened the moment Holmes requested to speak in private. "Mr. Braddon," Holmes began, "I ask your forgiveness in revisiting familiar ground, but I am compelled to clarify certain matters. You stated previously that you made only 2 suits from the forest fen wool, one for Reginald Ferntree and one for Ambrose Damery. Is that still your position?" Braddon hesitated. "Yes, Mr. Holmes, to the best of my knowledge." "To the best of your knowledge," Holmes repeated. "And yet the records from your apprentice suggest a 3rd was commissioned, by a client listed only as EP 2 fittings. No delivery noted." Braddon's brow furrowed. I don't recall authorizing a 3rd suit." Holmes handed over a slip of paper. "Your apprentice, young Charles, made careful notes. EP ordered the suit, then vanished before the final fitting. But the cloth was cut. The lining matched Damery's silver silk. Who is EP, Mr. Braddon?" The tailor looked stricken. I don't know. Charles never showed me this." Holmes's voice remained calm. "Then, perhaps it is time you did some remembering, because someone tailored a 3rd suit from the same bolt of cloth. Someone with access to your workshop, your schedule, and your reputation." Braddon swallowed hard. "It could have been a theft. We had a break-in last November. Minor tools gone. I didn't think to report it." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, remind me. The original parcel delivered to Lavington came from York Crescent. That address, as it happens, is barely 2 streets from where Charles, the apprentice, resides." "Too neat by half." Braddon blinked. "You can't believe Charles, he's just a boy." "Precisely," Holmes said, turning, "which means he was either duped or deceived, or someone used his identity to commission that 3rd suit." He straightened. "We shall interview Charles, but I believe we are looking for someone who had motive to frame Damery, access to tailoring materials, and a deep resentment of Terence Lavington." Braddon looked ill. "There is one man, used to work here. Elias Parkin, brilliant hand, temper like a cracked whip. I let him go 6 months ago after a dispute over commissions. He was furious. Said I'd stolen credit for his work. Even claimed the forest fen design was his." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And was it?" Braddon said nothing. Holmes stood. "Then, Mr. Braddon, I suggest you write down everything you remember about Elias Parkin. Address, connections, associates. If he is the 3rd suit's owner, then we are dealing with a forger, a tailor, and possibly, most chillingly, a murderer." Back in our cab, Holmes remained quiet until we reached the edge of Soho, where Parkin had once resided. The fog was beginning to creep in once more, curling around the lamp-posts and shop-fronts like an old secret. Holmes broke the silence. "The needle can mend, Watson, but it can also pierce. I believe Elias Parkin saw in Damery both a rival and a scapegoat. If he crafted a suit identical to Damery's, copied Lavington's handwriting, and orchestrated the circumstances around the murder, then what we have uncovered is not the truth, but the illusion of truth." "And what if Parkin is gone?" I asked, Holmes's mouth drew into a tight line. Then we follow the thread again, however long it winds. The case, once neatly hemmed and seemingly complete, had now burst at the seams. By the following morning the weather had turned bitter. Again, the kind of frost that etched its presence onto every window pane in the city, and made even the coal fires feel inadequate. Holmes, however, was energized by the chill, as though the tension in the air sharpened his focus. "Watson," he said briskly, donning his overcoat, "the time has come to pay a visit to the last name on our tailor's roll, Elias Parkin. If this man is half the craftsman Braddon described, and twice as resentful, he may well be the invisible hand that threaded this entire mystery." We rode through Soho in silence, the cab wheels cracking softly over ice-slicked stones. The address Braddon provided was in Camden Passage, above a disused cobbler's shop that had once served as a lively storefront, but now bore boarded windows and the unmistakable staleness of abandonment. The name Parkin remained faintly visible on a rusted brass plate beside the door. Holmes rapped 3 times with his cane. No answer. He tried the knob, found it locked, and stepped back to examine the frame. After a moment's pause, he nodded. "Recently used. Note the wear around the latch, scraped fresh, likely with a thin-bladed key. This flat is not as abandoned as it appears." With deft motion, he produced a pick from his coat and worked at the lock. Within moments it clicked open and we stepped inside. The narrow stairwell was choked with dust and cobwebs, but the air held a faint scent of recent habitation, cigar smoke, oil, something tangy and chemical. At the top of the stairs was a single door. Holmes pushed it open carefully. The interior was dimly lit by a narrow window facing the alley, and for a moment it appeared empty. Then, as our eyes adjusted, we saw the outlines of a tailoring bench, an open wardrobe, bolts of cloth arranged. With unnatural neatness, and on the far wall, a tall, full-length mirror, the surface of which was strangely smudged in a swirling pattern. Holmes moved forward silently, and I followed, keeping to the edges of the floorboards. It was clear this place had not been lived in precisely, but it had certainly been used. "There," Holmes murmured, pointing to a collection of pattern cuttings spread over the table. "Forest fen wool, cut in the same configuration as Braddon's. Records, but without a client name." He examined the pages swiftly. "Look at this. Measurements nearly identical to Damery's, but slightly off. Shoulders wider, arms longer. This suit was made to mimic Damery's figure, from memory or observation." "A disguise?" I asked. "A replica," Holmes replied. "Parkin not only framed Damery by forging a document, he stitched a phantom version of the man himself." Holmes moved to the mirror, studying the swirling pattern. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he pulled it forward on its hinges, revealing a hidden cabinet behind. Inside were 3 items: a narrow wooden box containing fountain pens and ink bottles, a folded page scrawled in cramped script, and, most revealing of all, a small, ornate seal stamp. Holmes lifted the folded page and scanned it silently. Then he handed it to me. It read, "They'll believe what they see. They always do. One thread is all it takes if stitched with care." Damery's arrogance was his weakness. He wore it like a badge. Braddon reaped what I sowed. And Lavington, he should have kept silent. He forgot that some garments are meant never to be unpicked. There was no signature. But in the bottom corner, pressed in black wax, was the image of a tailor's shears. Set against a crescent moon, Holmes turned to me. "It's not only a confession, it's a philosophy. Parkin sees himself as both craftsman and architect. This isn't about revenge alone, it's a performance." We searched the rest of the flat, but Parkin himself was nowhere to be found. A scrawled calendar on the wall had several dates circled in red, and a recent note, SR 1030, was jotted beside today's date. SR? I asked. Savile Row. Holmes replied at once. Parkin was once a rising star among tailors. He knows the institutions well. Perhaps he's returned to make one last move. An hour later we arrived at Savile Row, the Mecca of London's tailoring elite. It was a place of crisp lines and quiet conversations, of garments so finely constructed they seemed to defy the wear of time. Holmes led the way, checking discreetly with shopkeepers and clerks, his inquiries gentle, almost casual. At last, in the back hallway of an exclusive establishment known as Weatherby and Gray, we received confirmation. A man matching Parkin's description had come asking for fittings and appointments. Under the name Elias Prentice, he had claimed to be in town only briefly and left little impression beyond his scar and his insistence on discretion. He booked an appointment for this morning, the manager informed us, though he hasn't shown. Holmes frowned. And which fitting room was he assigned? Number 4, sir. Holmes turned without further word and strode to the back hallway. Fitting room 4 was closed but not locked. Holmes pushed it open slowly. The room was empty, but not untouched. On the coat hook hung a waistcoat made from forest fen wool. On the table rested a small folded card with a name written in elegant script. Holmes picked it up and read it aloud. Sherlock Holmes. I stared. He meant for you to find it. He did, Holmes said. This is no longer concealment, it's invitation. He inspected the waistcoat and found inside the lining another note, shorter than the last. You found the suit. Now find the man behind the mirror. Holmes handed the note to me and turned toward the door. Watson, I believe Parkin is no longer hiding. He is staging his final act. Then we must stop him. Holmes nodded. Yes, but not with force, with precision. He's a tailor by trade, and every movement he makes is calculated to fit. He paused, then murmured, There's one place we haven't searched. One tailor's name that never appeared on any ledger but has loomed over the pattern since the beginning. You don't mean I do, Holmes said. Parkin did not choose Bratton's shop by chance. He once apprenticed under a man named Sutton Black, an eccentric recluse known for stitching theatre costumes and ceremonial regalia. Black retired years ago, but his shop remains, closed, shuttered, and forgotten, yet still leased, still paid for by anonymous draft. Then that's where Parkin's hiding? If not in body, Holmes said, then in memory, in symbol, in final design. That mirror was no metaphor. Parkin wants me to look past the surface into what I've missed. He turned to me. Come, Watson. The curtain is rising, and I believe our villain has saved his finest stitch for last. We left Savile Row behind, the cobblestones glistening beneath the low sun. As the cab made its way toward Blackfriars, where Sutton Black's shuttered premises stood like a ghost of garments past, I watched Holmes closely. His eyes were calm, but I could see the threads winding in his mind, unraveling, tightening, pulling everything into place. The tailor had sewn his alibi shut, but the man behind the needle had left one seam untouched, and Holmes intended to open it, no matter how deep the stitch ran. We arrived at Blackfriars just after noon, the sun glinting weakly through a layer of haze that cast London in a dull, sepia tone. Sutton Black's old shop stood near the corner of an alley off Pilgrim Street, tucked beside a row of shuttered apothecaries and forgotten print shops. The building itself looked like something lifted from a Dickens novel, its windows coated in grime, its wooden sign faded to illegibility, and its door sealed not with a padlock, but a subtle sense of abandonment. Holmes stood before it in silence for nearly a minute. Then he stepped forward and ran a gloved hand along the edge of the frame. I could see his gaze sharpen, fixed on a seam in the wood just beneath the lintel. This door, he murmured, has been opened recently. How can you tell? I asked, lowering my voice. Cobwebs disturbed, Holmes replied. Slight abrasions in the paint near the lock, and a faint scent, machine oil and warmed dust. This place has a beating heart, Watson, however faint. He retrieved his lockpicks once more and worked quickly. The mechanism gave way with a soft click, and he pushed the door inward. The air within was stale, but not dead. Dust floated in the narrow stream of sunlight that slipped through a cracked upper window. The shop retained the structure of its former function: 3 long tables for cutting and pressing cloth, shelves stacked with ancient bolts of fabric, and a mannequin at the far end, dressed in a half-completed cloak that appeared more theatrical than practical. Holmes stepped inside, each footfall deliberate. Stay alert. Parkin is a man of patterns, not impulse, but desperation, even for the most meticulous mind, can fray the edges. I followed him through the narrow space, noting the traces of occupation that hadn't existed in years: a fresh teacup on a sideboard, a trimmed candle stub, and on one table a sketch of a theatre stage with costume diagrams inked along the margins. "He's been here," I said, gesturing to the drawing. Holmes examined it briefly, then moved toward the back wall where a long mirror was mounted above a wash basin. He paused. "Observe, Watson, the mirror again." Indeed, the glass was marked by more swirling smudges, similar to those we had seen in Parkin's Camden flat. Holmes tilted it forward slightly, revealing not a cabinet this time, but something far stranger. Behind the mirror was a thimble. It sat embedded in a shallow niche cut into the wall, perfectly centered, its polished silver surface gleaming faintly. Holmes withdrew it with great care, turning it over in his hand. Inside was a single piece of paper, tightly rolled and bound with black thread. He unrolled it. It read, "You see, Mr. Holmes, even the smallest tools can hold the deepest secrets. This thimble stitched more lies than any needle ever did. You've followed the thread, but have you followed the pattern?" Holmes folded the note and tucked it into his coat. "He's taunting us, Watson, but also leading us. This is not a retreat, it's a stage, and he's preparing his final curtain." He turned back to the room and began scanning the floor with keen precision. I watched as he examined the floorboards beneath the central table, knocking gently along the seams until he paused near a wide knot in the wood. "This one is hollow." He pulled back the rug and revealed a discreet brass ring. With a motion of restraint, Holmes gestured for silence, then lifted the ring slowly. A trapdoor. We crouched beside it, and Holmes held out his hand. No torches, no noise, just shadows. He opened the trapdoor with a soft creak. Below was darkness, a set of narrow stairs descending into what looked to be a cellar or subchamber. The scent of damp wool and burnt wax wafted upward. Holmes led the way. The stairs were steep and the air damp, but the chamber at the bottom was unmistakably occupied. Rows of shelves lined the walls, filled with tailor's materials, old theatre programs, ink bottles, and, most disturbingly, photographs. Dozens of photographs, all of Holmes, from newspapers, surveillance, candid sketches even. Holmes reaching for a cab door, Holmes leaving Scotland Yard, Holmes speaking on a street corner. "What in heaven's name?" I breathed. Holmes remained silent. On a large table stood a tailor's dummy, wearing yet another replica of Damery's suit. This one finely finished and complete down to the signature buttons, Braddon used only for his highest-paying clients. But stitched on the inside of the lapel, in tiny white letters, were the words, "The Man Who Missed the Stitch." Holmes read it and let out a breath that was not quite laughter. He believes I missed something vital. I moved to the far shelf, where a ledger lay open. I scanned the names. Many were scratched out, many were pseudonyms, but one caught my eye. "Watson," I said aloud, "look at this." He joined me. The name written there, in confident black ink. Clara Lavington. The entry was dated 2 weeks before her brother's death. The line beside it read, "Client, Silk Commission, consultation regarding correspondence." Holmes froze. "What did Clara say to us?" I whispered. "That she saw only part of the letter her brother burned, that she never read its full content." Holmes's face was unreadable. "She may have lied, or she may have been used." He moved back to the photographs, flipping through them more rapidly now. Behind one, tucked in a folded envelope, was a letter with Clara's handwriting. It was short, direct, and unmistakable. "Mr. Parkin, I've done as asked. He suspects nothing. The clause has been copied. The rest is in your hands. I want him out of this forever." Holmes handed the letter to me without speaking. Clara Lavington. She had not merely been a grieving sister. She had been part of the tailoring, part of the plot. Holmes stood still for a long moment, then straightened with sudden clarity. She hated what Damery had done to her brother, hated the courts that let him go unpunished, and she found a tailor with equal bitterness, a man who saw in deception an art form. I stared at the letter again. So she asked Parkin to help destroy Damery. Holmes's expression hardened, and he used her grief to craft a play of his own, one where the cast never knew they were on stage. A sudden creak from the trapdoor above caught our attention. We both froze. A soft voice descended. "Curious, isn't it, Mr. Holmes?" "Parkin." The door above closed again. Then silence. Holmes looked at me and whispered, "He's here, watching." He raised a finger for silence and turned toward the corner of the room where the shadows were deepest. In them a set of footprints in the dust, fresh. He followed them to a wall panel, pressed gently. It opened. A second door. A narrow passage beyond. But Parkin was gone. We emerged into a hidden rear alley behind the shop, empty but for the echo of a man retreating into silence. Holmes straightened his coat. "He won't run," he said quietly. "He's not finished." "And Clara?" I asked. "She must answer," Holmes said grimly. "Not just for what she did, but for what she set in motion." The curtain had not yet fallen, but we were finally in the wings, and the final act was near. It was nearing dusk when we returned to Baker Street, our boots heavy with alley dust and our minds thick with revelations. Holmes said little during the ride, seated across from me with his chin pressed into his hands. The letter from Clara Lavington folded tightly in his coat pocket, like a secret that weighed far more than its paper could account for. Once inside, he lit the fire with mechanical precision and poured himself a measure of brandy, sipping it not for pleasure but as if attempting to warm the thoughts running cold through his veins. "I was wrong, Watson," he said quietly, the flames reflecting in his eyes, or rather, I was led to be wrong. "About Damery?" I asked. "No, Damery remains guilty of fraud, deceit, and cowardice. But the greater design, the orchestration of the murder, the thread that ran through each stitch of this affair, was not solely his. Clara Lavington and Elias Parkin crafted something far more elaborate than revenge. They tailored justice in their own image." He paused and exhaled slowly. "And now it falls to us to unpick it, one stitch at a time." I opened my notebook, flipping back to my earliest entries. The green thread, the locked room, the tailor's spool. How distant it all now seemed, as if that first clue had belonged to a different case entirely. Holmes turned from the fire. "We must speak with Clara again, at once, but not as we did before. This time no courtesy, no assumptions, only the truth." Clara Lavington received us at Belgrave Place with an expression of composed alarm, her features taut but not surprised. She led us into the sitting room and offered tea, which Holmes declined. "Miss Lavington, he began in a voice far colder than before. "You told us your brother received an anonymous letter the night before his death, that you saw only a fragment of it, and that it was burned. That was a lie." Clara's breath hitched slightly, but she said nothing. "You also claim to know nothing of Elias Parkin," Holmes continued, "yet we have evidence of your communication with him, letters in your own hand, preserved in a hidden chamber, beneath Sutton Black's abandoned shop." Her eyes did not leave his. Holmes stepped closer, now holding the letter. "You hired him." Silence stretched long between them. "I didn't hire him," she said finally, her voice low. "Thiosin appealed to him." Holmes said nothing. "I knew of Parkin through Terence," Clara continued. "My brother once admired his work. He'd said Parkin was brilliant but unstable. After Terence began investigating the Billingsworth estate and Damery's involvement, he grew increasingly worried, said someone was watching him. When I mentioned that to an acquaintance in the theatre, they said Parkin had returned quietly, working under pseudonyms, so I sought him out." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "And asked him what, exactly?" "To make Damery pay," she said, simply. "I was not precise. I asked him to expose Damery's fraud, to ruin his name in a way the courts never would. I never asked him to kill my brother." Holmes's voice sharpened. "But you knew Parkin was unstable. You knew his methods. You gave him access, and you let your hatred speak louder than reason." Clara's hands trembled. "You've no idea what it was like, Mr. Holmes, to watch the man who ruined my brother's career and reputation walk free. Terence was not just a solicitor. He believed in the system. When that failed, he began to fall apart. He didn't eat, didn't sleep. When he died—" She stopped, her voice catching. "He didn't take his own life, Miss Lavington," Holmes said, more gently now. "He was murdered, and you set that in motion." She looked away. "I didn't know Parkin would go that far." "But he did," Holmes said, "and he used you as much as you used him. He saw in your grief a way to orchestrate something grand, something he could claim as a masterpiece." She buried her face in her hands. I stepped forward. "Clara, there's still time to set it right. Parkin is out there unfinished. You know that as well as we do. If you help us, we can find him before he strikes again." She looked up slowly. "You think he will?" Holmes nodded. "I believe he already intends it. He left us notes, staging props, and signs of further movements. He believes this story isn't done." She hesitated. Then, almost inaudibly, she said, "He used to mention an old costume warehouse in Lambeth, abandoned for years. He said it was where his finest work would one day hang." Holmes exchanged a look with me. "Then that is where we must go." The warehouse in Lambeth was a skeletal husk of its former self. Once used to store elaborate costumes for operatic productions, it now loomed like a theatre long since closed, its iron beams groaning with rust and wind. We arrived after sundown, and Holmes insisted we approach on foot, silently. Inside, the air was colder than outside, and the vast space echoed with the soft creak of ancient floorboards and distant dripping water. But it was not empty. Lights, dim, yellow, and theatrical, hung from ropes above a central platform. Upon that platform stood a mannequin, dressed once again in the green forest fen wool suit, identical to the others. Holmes advanced slowly, motioning for me to circle wide. Clara remained in the shadows behind us, her coat drawn tightly around her. Then, from the dark rafters above, a voice. "You found the final piece, Mr. Holmes. I must say, I'm impressed." Holmes looked upward. "You overplayed your hand, Parkin." A chuckle echoed through the steel girders. "No, Holmes. I laid the pattern. You followed it, stitch by stitch. And now we're both exactly where we were meant to be." Holmes said nothing. Parkin stepped into the light from above. He wore a black overcoat, his face pale and worn, but his eyes burning with manic clarity. I didn't kill Lavington to silence him. I did it because he refused to see the performance. I gave him a stage, a part, and he tore up the script. So I wrote a new one. And Clara? Holmes asked. A fellow playwright, Parkin said, though her story ends here. He raised a small pistol. In that instant, Clara stepped from the shadows. Elias, don't! Parkin froze. She stepped forward slowly. You said we would fix the system, not destroy it. Terence would never have wanted this. The gun trembled in his hand. It was meant to be perfect. But you ruined it, she said, tears now brimming. You ruined everything. Holmes took the moment. In one swift motion, he launched his cane across the floor. It struck Parkin's hand and the pistol clattered to the boards. Lestrade and 2 constables burst through the doors seconds later, having been summoned by Holmes earlier, and instructed to wait until the signal came, his cane on the floor. Parkin did not resist. He sank to his knees, whispering something we couldn't hear. Later that night, Holmes sat quietly by the fire, staring at the thimble on the mantelpiece, the one that had led us to the trapdoor. Parkin stitched the illusion of guilt so tightly that even truth struggled to breathe beneath it, he said. And Clara, I asked. She will not hang, but she will answer. Her guilt is real, if not bloody. I nodded. So it ends. Holmes smiled faintly. All garments end, Watson. But some must be unravelled before they can be mended. And with that he turned. Back to the fire, the shadows stitching themselves once more along the walls of Baker Street, where truth and illusion always danced their quiet pas de deux.